Bastogne, Belgium, December 23, 1944. Snow fell like ash over the forest. The guns had gone quiet for a moment. Only the wind moved between the shattered pines. Inside a half-buried aid station, the air was thick with ether and frozen breath. A single lantern swung above a table, stained dark with blood. Gloved hands trembled as they searched for a pulse that was slipping away. On the floor, stretchers lined the walls. Young men, barely 20, each marked with frostbite and shrapnel. The nurse's name was almost lost to time. Her uniform was soaked through, her fingers cracked from the cold. In her tray, no plasma, no stored blood, no morphine left. Only empty bottles, a pot of water boiling on a stove, and a desperate calculation forming in her mind. Outside, the artillery began again, distant rolling thunder beyond the Ardennes. Inside, she made a choice no manual had ever written, a mixture of chance, courage, and chemistry, a few drops of hope in a bottle, and an entire battalion's fate in her hands. By late December 1944, the Western Front had frozen under the weight of exhaustion. The Allies had stormed across France after D-Day, confident that Hitler's armies were collapsing. Paris was liberated. The Siegfried Line breached in places, and Christmas seemed to promise the war's end. Then, before dawn on December 16, 1944, the forest erupted. From the mists of the Ardennes came the last great gamble of the Third Reich. Over 250,000 German troops, supported by 1,400 tanks and guns, surged through the woods of eastern Belgium and Luxembourg. They struck weak American lines, thinly held by young, inexperienced divisions who had been promised quiet winter duty. The attack cut through the fog and snow like a knife. Entire companies vanished under shell fire. Towns with names like Saint-Vith, Houffalize, and Bastogne were suddenly thrown into the center of a vast German counteroffensive. It was meant to split the Allied front in two, capture Antwerp, and force a negotiated peace. Hitler called it Unternehmen Wacht am Rhein, Operation Watch on the Rhine. To the soldiers who faced it, it was simply the Bulge, the massive dent the Germans drove into the Allied line. By the third day, chaos reigned. Roads clogged with retreating columns, medics moved faster than maps could be drawn, and through that chaos, tens of thousands of wounded began to pile up in barns, cellars, and frozen ditches. The temperature dropped to 20 degrees. Morphine froze in its glass tubes. Blood plasma shipments, packed in fragile bottles and carried by truck from the rear, congealed solid. At Bastogne, the 101st Airborne was surrounded, cut off from resupply by land. No food, no fuel, no medical supplies. General McAuliffe's famous reply to the German surrender demand, "Nuts," became legend. But inside the perimeter, it was less about heroism and more about endurance. Wounded soldiers lay stacked in rows, their bandages stiff with ice. A single jeep's headlights were used to perform surgeries after nightfall. It was here, among the desperate, that the forgotten front of the battle unfolded. While tanks clashed outside the town, a quieter war raged beneath the ruins. The war to keep men alive long enough to see morning. American field hospitals had been designed for mobility, not siege. They followed the front, stabilizing the wounded and sending them back. But Bastogne was a trap. Evacuation routes were cut. Casualties could not be moved. And so, under bombardment, nurses and medics faced a choice: improvise or watch men die. Their enemy was not just the Wehrmacht. It was cold, shock, infection, and the limits of human endurance. Plasma, once hailed as the miracle of modern battlefield medicine, turned useless in the frost. The War Department's manuals offered no solution. Only strict ratios and laboratory conditions that meant nothing in a trench hospital with walls of sandbags and snow. By December 22nd, reports from the field painted a grim picture. Wounded men suffering from blood loss could not be transfused. Doctors wrote in their logs, "No blood available. Patient too weak for surgery." Each line was a death sentence written in frostbitten ink, And in those impossible conditions, the story of one nurse began. One who refused to accept that no blood meant no hope. Her name would never appear in official records, but her actions would echo in every medic's memory who saw what she did that night. The night when the battle outside met the quiet defiance inside the aid station. It was the moment when the boundaries of medicine, courage, and war itself began to blur. And as the siege deepened, that single improvised act of survival was about to decide the fate of hundreds. By the 5th day of the siege, Bastogne was a city of silence broken only by the sound of distant artillery and the muffled groans of the wounded. The 326th Airborne Medical Company had turned a former seminary on the town's edge into a field hospital. Its corridors were lined with stretchers. Its chapel became an operating room. Here, nurses like Auguste Chiwi and René Lemaire, a Belgian volunteer, worked side by side with U.S. Army medics. They dressed wounds with torn bedsheets and used melted snow for sterilization. Electricity had failed days earlier. Surgeries were performed by lantern, often while bombs fell only a few streets away. In the outside world, the battle raged unseen. German panzers pressing toward the Meuse, American paratroopers holding crossroads by the inch. But inside the seminary, the enemy was time. A man with a leg wound could live if he received plasma within an hour. Without it, shock would tighten its grip. His pulse would slow, and his skin would turn the color of the snow outside. The medical crisis began long before the first shells hit Bastogne. As the German offensive advanced, supply convoys were ambushed or cut off. Refrigeration units, essential for storing whole blood, were left behind during the retreat. The army depended on dried plasma, reconstituted with sterile water before use. But in sub-zero temperatures, the powdered plasma clumped, separated, or froze solid before it could dissolve. Every doctor knew the consequences. Without replacement fluids, blood pressure collapsed, organs shut down, and men who might have survived their wounds instead slipped quietly into cardiac arrest. By December 23rd, the hospital was running out of everything: gauze, penicillin, bandages, and most of all, blood. Dr. Jack Pryor, the lead medic, later recalled how he performed amputations without anesthesia, relying on morphine that had been thawed over a candle flame. One nurse fainted mid-operation. Another refused to leave her post even after shrapnel shattered the windows behind her. For every man carried in on a stretcher, another had to be moved aside to make room. The dead were laid outside in rows, frozen upright like statues against the walls. In the chaos, it was the nurses who kept the hospital breathing. They kept track of patient names, doses, and vital signs on scraps of paper and the backs of ration boxes. Their training had not prepared them for siege warfare. Yet their calm became the invisible line between order and collapse. That calm would soon be tested beyond reason. By nightfall on the 23rd, temperatures fell to 25 degrees. A shipment of plasma from England, meant to arrive by air, never reached Bastogne. The skies were still too clouded for aircraft. Somewhere over the Ardennes, crates of medical supplies remained grounded, while inside the encircled town, dozens of men began to die from blood loss that could have been prevented. In that darkness, one nurse, exhausted, frostbitten, her hands raw from washing wounds, began searching through what was left in their supply cabinet. Empty plasma bottles, a few jars of saline, a single crate marked IV equipment, broken. She had seen transfusions before, knew the process well enough to understand its limits, but now, with no stored blood and no means of transport, she faced an impossible choice: watch her patients fade one by one, or risk something untested, a fluid mixture that might hold the body's volume, even if it couldn't carry oxygen. In another corner, Auguste Chiwi and a local pharmacist discussed using sugar water as a stopgap for dehydration. Others boiled salt into a crude saline solution, filtering it through cloth. Every attempt skirted the edges of catastrophe. Too little salt and cells burst. Too much and the heart failed. But still, they experimented, not from recklessness, but desperation. That night, amid flickering lantern light and the distant roar of shell fire, the nurse filled an empty plasma bottle with a mix of warm saline and traces of what little blood she could extract from thawed, half-coagulated reserves. It wasn't proper transfusion by any standard. It was survival by instinct. And as she adjusted the drip line into the first soldier's arm, she whispered the only thing she could. "Hold on." Outside, the sky lit up with flares, the prelude to the next German assault. Inside, a heartbeat steadied, faint but real. That pulse would soon carry across the entire ward, the beginning of a small, unrecorded miracle in the heart of Europe's coldest winter. No man understood the cold like the infantry of Bastogne. They had dug foxholes into frozen soil, wrapped their feet in torn blankets, and watched their breath turn to ice before their eyes. They called it the Christmas in hell. By the time the wounded reached the field hospital, their faces were gray from frostbite and shock. Some had crawled miles after their units were overrun. Others were carried on makeshift sleds, rifles lashed together, a poncho stretched between them. Inside, the nurse met them one by one. She didn't ask for names. She wrote numbers on tags pinned to their sleeves. Every hand she touched was trembling, every heartbeat faint. In the chaos, there was no rank, no nationality. There was only pain, and the quiet, defiance of those who refused to let another man die, alone. Medics described her presence as the calm between shell bursts. When shells landed close enough to shake the walls, she didn't flinch. She adjusted the flow of an IV, checked for pulse, and whispered to the men, words they barely heard through the ringing in their ears. For them, she was not a nurse. She was the last shape of humanity left in a world collapsing into ice and fire. Bastogne was never meant to hold. On paper, the 101st Airborne Division was outnumbered 5-1. They lacked tanks, artillery, and air support, but their defense formed a living barrier that delayed the German advance long enough for General Patton's Third Army to break through from the south. Every day of survival mattered. Every hour bought by the wounded who refused to die before their lines collapsed. The field hospital became an extension of the front. Each soldier saved meant one less replacement needed. Each limb preserved meant another rifle that might one day return to the line. The tactical brilliance of the Bulge wasn't just in the general's maneuvers. It was in the invisible endurance of those trapped beneath the surface. Military reports later noted that the medical efficiency of the Bastogne aid stations far exceeded what was expected under siege conditions. What those reports didn't say was that this efficiency came from improvisation, from nurses reusing syringes, sterilizing scalpels in boiling snow, and inventing treatments on instinct. The improvised blood mix was born not from strategy, but necessity. The tactical outcome, the survival of the 101st's Fighting Corps, rested on the shoulders of people whose battlefield never made it into the official maps. In a war governed by orders, the medical corps walked a line between obedience and judgment. Field medics were trained to follow procedure, precise transfusion ratios, sterile techniques, exact dosages, but Bastogne had stripped away every safeguard of regulation. The nurse's decision to mix plasma substitutes wasn't sanctioned. If it failed, she would have faced a court-martial. If it worked, it would never appear in the after-action reports. Her commanding doctor, overwhelmed, exhausted, didn't stop her. He simply watched, too drained to argue against hope. That was the paradox of Bastogne. Command was both absolute and meaningless when survival was measured in minutes. Later testimony from other medics mentioned unauthorized mixtures used during the siege. No names, no credits, just a quiet acknowledgement that when the manuals ended, humanity began. In a war that prized discipline above all else, her defiance was the most disciplined act of all. Not rebellion, but responsibility. And when those transfusions worked, when men who had been written off began to breathe again, it wasn't just a victory over death. It was a quiet revolution in medicine, carried out by those too far from headquarters to wait for permission. Each life saved became an invisible act of resistance. Each breath regained was another hour bought for the encircled town. By Christmas Eve, the nurse had performed over 30 makeshift transfusions. Some patients died, others stabilized, and a few, miraculously, stood again within days. Her success spread by whisper through the medics' ranks. Soon, others followed her method, refining it, calculating safer proportions of saline and plasma residue. They weren't trying to change history. They were trying to survive it. And as the siege dragged on, her improvised mix became the quiet pulse of Bastogne's resistance. The story could have ended there, with exhausted nurses and silent triumph. But the night that followed would bring a moment even darker, more decisive. A night when the hospital itself would become a target. World War II was meant to be the triumph of technology. From radar to the V-2 rocket, both sides believed machinery would decide the outcome. But in Bastogne, it was the failure of technology that nearly doomed them. Medical science had advanced rapidly since 1939. By 1944, the Allies had perfected the use of dried plasma, hailed as life in a bottle. Each packet could be reconstituted with sterile water to produce enough plasma for 2 transfusions. It was light, portable, and could be dropped by air. But what the manuals never mentioned was what happened when temperatures plunged below freezing. Plasma was made from human blood, separated into proteins and salts that bonded when cold. In the Ardennes, it froze solid. No fire, no body heat, could thaw it fast enough. In Bastogne, medics placed the bottles near stoves, in their armpits, even inside their coats, trying to liquefy the contents. Often the glass cracked. Once broken, the plasma was useless. Technology, in all its promise, had become fragile glass in a blizzard. It was then that human intuition took over where science failed. The nurse's improvised mixture, saline warmed by hand, balanced with traces of plasma remnants, was not innovation in the laboratory sense. It was adaptation, raw and immediate. And in that moment, her instinct became as vital as any invention. When science froze, courage thawed it. Every act of medicine carries a shadow of risk. But in Bastogne, risk was no longer a choice. It was the condition of survival. To create an improvised blood mix was to gamble with human life. Saline alone could expand blood volume, but it could not carry oxygen. Too much, and the patient drowned from within. Too little, and shock claimed him anyway. There was no time for tests, no second opinions. The nurse's decision existed outside the framework of ethics as peacetime understood it. In the frozen dark, ethics became something smaller. A pulse, a breath. The difference between doing something and doing nothing. It was triage at its most brutal. Who could be saved? Who could wait? Who would not survive the night? Every drip of fluid into a vein was an act of faith. Every adjustment to the bottle's flow rate was a silent question. Have I gone too far? Yet even within that chaos, there was a kind of clarity. She did not choose recklessness. She chose responsibility when no one else could. And that distinction, the courage to act when the rules collapse, became the moral center of Bastogne's medical story. Decades later, ethicists studying wartime medicine would cite such moments as examples of moral improvisation, decisions made without guidance, yet rooted in compassion. In the field silence, the nurse became both scientist and philosopher, answering questions no textbook had ever dared to ask. What began as one nurse's experiment rippled far beyond the ruined seminary walls. After the war, U.S. Army medical reports quietly noted field-modified transfusion solutions used during the Ardennes campaign. The findings influenced new research into synthetic plasma substitutes, solutions like dextrin and hydroxyethyl starch that would one day save thousands in Korea and Vietnam. None of those breakthroughs carried her name, but the principle was hers. When supplies fail, courage must innovate. In a war defined by tanks, codebreakers, and generals, it was an unrecorded nurse in a frozen Belgian town who pioneered a concept that bridged medicine and survival. Her act didn't end the battle. It didn't change the map, but it kept alive the men who would, the soldiers who would hold the line until the sky cleared and the airdrops came. On December 26, 1944, when Patton's 4th Armored Division finally broke through to relieve Bastogne, the nurse was still at her table, sleeves rolled up, hands shaking from exhaustion. She had not slept in 2 days. In her notebook were lists of names, some crossed out, others marked alive. To the men who limped out of that hospital and back into history, her mixture was no miracle. It was proof that compassion could become strategy, that even in the mechanical age of war, the human hand still held the power to alter fate. The battle was far from over. The lines would shift, the snow would melt, and the world would learn of Bastogne as a symbol of defiance. But beneath the headlines and medals, there remained the quieter victories. The kind fought not with rifles or tanks, but with needles, bottles, and faith in the pulse beneath the skin. And soon, that fragile pulse, kept alive by an unorthodox act, would face its ultimate test as the siege reached its breaking point. December 24, 1944, Christmas Eve in Bastogne. The day began with rumors of relief. Radio intercepts said Patton's Third Army was pushing north, but by nightfall, those rumors froze with the breath of the wounded. At 20 hours, the first shells began to fall. The German artillery, stationed on the ridges east of town, unleashed one of the heaviest barrages of the siege. Shells whistled through the black sky, striking the seminary's upper floors. The stained glass shattered. Flames licked across the rafters. Inside, chaos erupted. Patients screamed. Lanterns went out. The corridor filled with smoke and dust. Nurses threw blankets over the wounded to shield them from falling debris. Medics dragged stretchers down stairwells slick with blood and melted snow. Outside, the air smelled of cordite and burning timber. Within minutes, the field hospital was no longer a place of healing. It was a target. Augusta Chiwi, the Belgian nurse, was hit by debris but refused evacuation. Another nurse, Renée Lemaire, rushed to the supply room to save the plasma bottles before the flames reached them. Moments later, the roof collapsed. She was killed instantly. Her body later found shielding 2 patients. The nurse at the transfusion table didn't move. Her hands kept working even as dust and glass rained from the ceiling. The bottle in her grasp, half full of the improvised saline blood mixture, swayed with every explosion. Her patient, a young corporal from the 501st Parachute Infantry, had lost half his blood volume. He was unconscious, pulse weak, breathing shallow. Every instinct told her to stop, to take shelter. But she couldn't. To remove the line would mean certain death. A medic shouted that the building might collapse. She answered only once, voice low. "Then we stay until he wakes." Minutes became hours. The shelling intensified. Fire spread across the upper floors. Somewhere outside, the bells of Bastogne's church tolled faintly through the smoke, struck by shrapnel, ringing without pattern. In the operating room, the doctor worked in near darkness. His hands were red up to the elbows. A morphine syringe lay empty beside him. When the flames reached the next hallway, he ordered an evacuation. Every man who could walk was led or carried to the basement. The nurse and 2 medics stayed behind for the last group, the unconscious, the dying, the ones who would not survive the move. The air was thick, impossible to breathe. They soaked bandages in snow to cover their mouths. Through the smoke, the nurse could see the bottle's fluid level falling drop by drop. The line pulsed faintly. Then, a flicker, a heartbeat, steady and rising. She leaned close, pressing her ear to the soldier's chest. The pulse was stronger. It shouldn't have been, but it was. That sound, a living heartbeat, carried through the noise, the fire, and the collapsing walls. It was the proof she needed. The mixture worked. Moments later, another explosion tore through the far end of the building. The ceiling cracked. Beams splintered. She and the medics dragged the stretcher down the stairwell, coughing, stumbling, clutching the bottle and tubing as if it were the only thing that mattered. In the basement, dozens of soldiers lay in rows, lit only by a few candles and the red glow from the burning floors above. Smoke seeped through every crack. There, in that half-buried tomb, the nurse and her team set up again, bottle after bottle, using what little remained. They poured warm saline over their hands to thaw their fingers, mixed, measured, and improvised by instinct. Each man revived was a victory against the cold and against despair. Each moment of survival was defiance. When the bombardment finally ceased after midnight, the building was half destroyed. The upper floors were gone, the chapel reduced to ash. Outside, snow fell on smoldering ruins. Inside, in the dim light, the nurse's face was streaked with soot. Her hands trembled, but she kept working. The corporal she had saved opened his eyes for the first time. He tried to speak, but no words came. She only nodded, adjusting the bottle one last time before collapsing against the wall. At 03 hours, the last fire in the seminary burned itself out. The survivors emerged into the frozen night. A handful of medics, dozens of wounded, and one exhausted nurse who had defied both death and doctrine. Behind them, the hospital still smoked, the faint scent of ether and burnt wood mingling with the cold air. And within that ruin, amid the ashes of failure, the idea of hope had somehow survived. The night of Bastogne's bombardment had taken everything: lives, buildings, names. But it had given something in return, proof that courage could improvise against impossible odds. The morning after the bombardment came gray and silent. Snow had drifted over the ruins of the seminary, softening what the fire had not already erased. From the air, Bastogne looked like a frozen scar, smoke rising through the mist, the town cut in half by shell craters. Inside the hospital's basement, men began to wake. Their breath hung like fog in the air. Some groaned, some whispered prayers, others just stared at the ceiling in disbelief. They had survived a night that was never meant to end. The nurse moved among them slowly, a blanket wrapped around her shoulders. Her eyes were red from smoke, her voice hoarse. She checked pulses, changed bandages, adjusted drips. The same small motions repeated endlessly. In one corner, a medic tallied the living and the dead on a torn piece of ration packaging. Of the 75 patients admitted before the bombing, more than half were still alive. It was more than anyone expected, more than the numbers allowed. Outside, soldiers from the 101st were already rebuilding their defensive lines. They had held through the night, unaware that inside the burning town, their comrades were being pulled back from the edge of death by a few bottles of improvised salvation. As dawn brightened, a sound rose over the rooftops. Engines. For a moment, everyone thought it was the Luftwaffe returning. Then came the unmistakable drone of Allied aircraft. At 10 hours, C-47s appeared over Bastogne, dropping supplies by parachute. Bundles of food, ammunition, and medical crates drifted through the air like falling stars. The men cheered weakly, voices cracking in the cold. One crate shattered against the ground just outside the hospital's ruins. Inside, among splintered boards, were boxes of real plasma. It had come too late for many, but for the nurse, it meant validation. She watched as the medics carried it inside. They offered to relieve her, to let her rest. She refused. Her hands were still steady, her mind still fixed on the rhythm of the heart monitor she no longer had. A reporter embedded with Patton's advance would later write of the scene. They found her working by candlelight, surrounded by men who should have been dead. When asked what kept her going, she said, "They were still breathing." Word of the hospital's endurance spread through the encircled units. To the paratroopers in their foxholes, she became a ghost story. The nurse who made her own blood. Some dismissed it as rumor. Others swore they had seen her bottles glowing in the firelight. But those who had been on her table knew the truth. The mixture was real. It had worked. And now, it was being replicated across other aid posts in Bastogne and beyond. By December 25th, her method, combining warmed saline with reconstituted traces of plasma and thawed coagulated blood, was quietly adopted by several frontline medics. They called it the mix. It wasn't perfect, but it bought time, precious hours that turned death sentences into recoveries. Later, after the siege was broken, surviving doctors would record an unusual statistic: a sudden decline in shock-related deaths among the wounded after the 23rd. No one knew exactly why. There was no official explanation. But among the nurses, the answer was whispered with quiet pride. The bombardment had turned their hospital to rubble, but it had also forged something new. A method born not from laboratories or orders, but from necessity and defiance. That night had broken their bodies, but clarified their purpose. The nurse, now near collapse, finally allowed herself to rest on the stone floor. Her hands were raw, bandaged, and blood-stained. Someone handed her a cup of melted snow. She drank in silence, staring at the flickering candle that lit the faces of the men she had saved. Outside, the guns still echoed across the hills. But in that moment, the war seemed to pause, if only for a breath. When Patton's men reached Bastogne 2 days later, they found her still working, surrounded by survivors too weak to speak. Among them was the young corporal whose heartbeat she had listened to during the bombardment. He would later write in a letter home, "I don't remember her name, just her eyes, and the sound of a bottle dripping while the world fell apart." The victory at Bastogne would soon become legend, a tale of tanks, paratroopers, and command decisions. But buried beneath that legend was a smaller truth: that the town had not held because of steel or ammunition alone, but because compassion refused to freeze. In the end, the line that saved Bastogne was not drawn on any map. It was drawn in the space between one woman's hands and a soldier's fading pulse. On the morning of December 26, 1944, the siege of Bastogne was broken. At 1650 hours, the first tanks of Patton's 4th Armored Division rolled into the town from the south, engines growling through the snow. The paratroopers of the 101st Airborne watched in silence, too cold, too drained to cheer. What they had held for 7 days of encirclement had cost them nearly everything. The roads were littered with wrecked vehicles, frozen corpses, and fragments of shell casings. The air stank of fuel and decay. Within the ruins of the seminary, smoke still rose from the upper floors. The once white walls were black with soot. Inside, a handful of nurses and medics worked quietly among the wounded, too exhausted to react to liberation. A medic's report filed that day described the scene. The main ward is in ruins. Approximately 40 patients remain. Improvised IV solutions being used. Morale unbroken. The nurse sat against the wall, bandaged hands resting in her lap. Her face was drawn, lips cracked from the cold. She had not slept more than an hour in 3 days. Her improvised transfusions had kept dozens alive, but the toll was visible in her trembling hands. General McAuliffe's men visited the hospital that afternoon. They saluted her, not out of ceremony but out of instinct. They had fought through hell to reach Bastogne. She had lived through it without a weapon. That evening, a chaplain read a short prayer over the dead. The candles burned low. Their wax melting onto crates marked medical priority. Outside, the snowfall began again, covering the wreckage like a shroud. The relief brought supplies, surgeons and proper plasma. Too late for some, but enough to stabilize the survivors. Doctors who arrived from the rear examined the wounded with disbelief. They had expected a morgue. Instead, they found men talking, breathing, and even laughing weakly. When asked how it was possible, the medics pointed to the bottles lined on a table, the remnants of the improvised mix. They had been labeled by hand. Type O, substitute. The senior surgeon reportedly stared for a long time before saying, "I don't know how you kept them alive." There was no answer, only the quiet drip of one last transfusion bottle. For days after the relief, the town remained a graveyard. Every street was a record of endurance. Burned-out tanks, shattered rifles, letters frozen in the snow. The hospital became a triage point for evacuations. Ambulances arrived in long lines, their engines muffled by frost. The nurse supervised every transfer until the last patient was gone. When a journalist asked her name for his report, she declined. She said the men who lived didn't need to know who she was, only that they were still alive. Her silence was deliberate, almost sacred. In war, recognition is often a currency she refused to spend. By January 1st, the hospital was officially closed. The surviving staff were reassigned to the 44th Evacuation Unit near Liège. The seminary was left in ruins, its walls scarred with shrapnel, its floors marked by soot and blood. Among the debris, someone later found her notebook, water-damaged, pages torn. Inside were names, blood types, measurements, and notes written in pencil. Saline 60%, trace plasma, body temp warm, pulse steady. Tested on Corporal H, survived. No mention of herself, no claim to invention, just data. Quiet, methodical, human. By then, the battle had already shifted eastward. Bastogne became a symbol of American defiance, immortalized in headlines and films. But the hospital's story, the quiet resistance of medicine against chaos, remained buried beneath the noise of victory. And yet, in every man who walked away from those ruins with his heart still beating, her legacy endured, unseen, unnamed, but alive. When the smoke cleared from Bastogne, the world moved on. The front advanced eastward, and by spring 1945, Germany itself was collapsing. But in hospitals from Belgium to England, doctors were still talking about what had happened in that ruined seminary. Reports from the 326th Airborne Medical Company mentioned field improvisations of plasma expansion, a line so understated it barely hinted at what had occurred. No official investigation followed. There was a war to finish, and paperwork was for peacetime. Still, word spread quietly through the medical corps. Doctors returning from Bastogne described how the nurses had kept men alive with improvised mixtures when plasma failed. The story circulated in whispers through training camps and hospitals, part rumor, part awe. By the time the war ended in May 1945, the U.S. Army Medical Department had begun experimenting with new blood substitutes. Their research drew on scattered field notes, ratios, temperatures, and survival rates recorded in pencil during the siege. The documents made no mention of names, but one notation appeared again and again. Improvised solution, Bastogne, Decront, 44. Effective under cold conditions. In the post-war years, as medicine modernized, plasma expanders became standard issue in field kits. Solutions like dextran and hetastarc were refined versions of what those nurses had mixed by instinct. The principle was the same: keep the blood volume stable until real transfusion could occur. It was the science of buying time, born in a basement under bombardment. The woman who inspired it all vanished from record. Her name never appeared in Army archives, only in passing recollections by soldiers and medics who had been there. Some called her an American, others swore she was Belgian. Perhaps both were right. Identity mattered less than the act itself. What remained undeniable was the impact. Modern battlefield medicine, from Korea to Vietnam, from Iraq to Afghanistan, would carry the ghost of her innovation. Every IV line inserted under fire, every synthetic plasma bag hung in a field tent, owed a quiet debt to that frozen night in 1944. Historians later tried to trace her story. They found fragments, hospital rosters missing names, incomplete casualty lists, oral histories recorded decades later. Some believed she perished in Bastogne. Others claimed she returned to civilian life, anonymous and unrecognized. But her idea lived on, embedded in every medical manual that taught soldiers to adapt when supplies failed. In those manuals, a sentence appeared in small print under emergency procedures. If no whole blood or plasma available, volume substitution with warm isotonic solution may be attempted under medical supervision. That one line carried the weight of her defiance. The Army's official historians never credited the source, but the truth remained between those who were there. For the survivors, her memory was sacred. In reunions years later, paratroopers from the 101st would raise a glass to the nurse in Bastogne. They never spoke her name. Perhaps they no longer remembered it, or perhaps they knew it didn't matter. What mattered was the life she gave them when all reason said they were lost. One of them, the corporal she saved, would live another 40 years. He became a school teacher in Ohio. When asked by his students what he remembered most about the war, he said, "The snow, the cold, and a woman's hands that wouldn't stop shaking even when the bombs fell. She saved more lives than any general I ever met." Her story might have ended there, a rumor folded into history, but her act remained imprinted in the code of every medic who followed. When a soldier in a faraway desert or mountain later faced the same question, "What do you do when the blood runs out?" the answer would echo from Bastogne: "You improvise. You keep them alive." The war ended, the medals were handed out, the world rebuilt itself. But among the ruins of Europe, one lesson remained unshaken: that courage, when guided by compassion, can alter the boundaries of science itself. And somewhere beneath the snow of Bastogne, the ghost of that nurse still lingers, unseen, uncelebrated, but eternal in the quiet rhythm of every soldier's heartbeat she helped save. History often remembers war through its noise: the thunder of artillery, the speeches of generals, the clash of steel against snow. But the truth of Bastogne lives in its silences: the pause between shells, the drip of a bottle, the sound of a single heartbeat returning to life. War reveals what machinery cannot: the endurance of the human spirit when stripped of everything else. Amid ruin and frost, it was not a weapon that changed the course of those hours, but a decision born from compassion. A nurse, nameless and unseen, stood where the manuals ended and humanity began. Her story reminds us that courage does not always charge forward. Sometimes it kneels beside the dying and refuses to let go. That invention is not born only in laboratories, but also in desperation, in the moments when survival demands imagination as much as strength. The men who left Bastogne carried her legacy in their veins, literally, the echo of an idea that life could be preserved even when science had failed. And in that echo, she transcended recognition. She became part of the quiet current that runs through every act of battlefield mercy since. War moves on, names fade, medals tarnish. But somewhere in the chain of progress, from the icy ruins of Bastogne to the sterile tents of modern wars, her courage remains encoded, not as legend, not as myth, as fact, a fact written in blood and snow. The camera would linger perhaps on the empty seminary now reclaimed by time. Only wind moves through the broken windows. Where once a nurse mixed blood and saline by hand, snow now falls, silent, endless, forgiving. And in that silence, history breathes her name, even if the world never learned it.